Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge Tech Talk on technology and innovation in the Ukraine conflict. We have three exciting speakers for you today. I asked just some housekeeping rules that you remain on mute. You leave your video off. And as you have questions, especially if they're for a specific speaker, that you put their name and the question in chat, and we will be taking questions at the end of the presentations, all three presentations. We will be sharing the slides that are being used to all participants or everyone who's on this Tech Talk after the event. And right now, I'm going to turn it over to Gerald Walker, who's the Tech Bridge Director, for a few opening remarks, and then we'll get started.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our Tech Talk. I'm Gerald Walker, the Director of the Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge. Just a few words about the Tech Bridge. It's a super connector for the regional innovation community and our DoD and Navy sponsors. It is a program under the Office of Naval Research, NavalX Agility Office. And we're here to really accelerate innovation and technical advances within the Navy by leveraging relationships and partnerships with non-traditional innovators that are in our regional spaces. We are one of 18 tech bridges globally, and we are very excited and appreciative that you're joining us for our Tech Talk. And without further ado, I will turn it back over to Tina so we can get this wonderful Tech Talk started.
All right, thank you, Gerald. And now I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Margarita, to introduce herself and speak on the topic. Margarita, I'm going to stop sharing and then the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you so much for having me here today, this afternoon. It's a really great pleasure, and I'm excited to touch on a topic that I've been studying for a long time, following the Russian military. Just in terms of background and introduction, I'm the Deputy Director of Analysis and Research Fellow at Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technologies, where I work on military applications of artificial intelligence.
They give you feedback after a while, they're like that.
Excuse me, I hope that wasn't for me. So I work on military applications of AI, Russian military technology, and I've also done a decent amount of work on urban warfare. So let's just say that the last couple of months have been quite busy work-wise, unfortunately. And what I want to do today is draw some early conclusions from discussions of innovation and technology in Ukraine war, with the major caveat that we're still very much in the middle of the conflict, and we know very little about how it may conclude, and is quite possible that the solution will not be a military one, but rather a political compromise of sorts. So we should really keep our minds and our eyes open, and by no means draw any sort of irrefutable conclusions about the trajectory and the outcome of this war. I want to make three broad points today. The first one, I think, is really important for this audience. And as I mentioned, I've been studying the Russian military, the Russian way of war, Russian technology, Russian military innovation for several years now. And I think one of the most surprising and striking things through this war have been a real overestimation of Russian capabilities and Russian technological competency, and even Russian military competency in general. And as those of us in the Russian military analyst community look back into our assessments and our understanding of Russian military developments and military innovation writ large, I think one key takeaway is that we have to do a better job in differentiating between concepts, research and development, experimentation, and adoption, let alone scaling to a point where an entire military force adopts a technology and knows how to employ it under operational conditions. So this difference between concepts, innovation, and adoption is fundamental in understanding not only the progression of the Ukrainian conflict, but also how we assess our own military capabilities here in the US and our adoption of emerging technologies, as well as how we assess the progress that our adversaries are making in this place, including China. The second set of comments that I want to, kind of touch upon here quite briefly speaks to the increasing importance of civilian technology companies and commercial technologies on modern battlefields. The war in Ukraine is by no means the first war to utilize commercial technologies or to see civilian technology companies play a role, but the scale and the impact and the diversity of applications employed, and the fact that a lot of it is unpredictable, innovative, new, and disruptive is quite new and something that is continually evolving and playing a really important role in the trajectory of the conflict, and something that we should absolutely be tracking, especially those of us that work on dual-use technologies, and what does that even mean in this context. And related to that, related to the proliferation of commercial and civilian technology on modern battlefields, is the realization, both from Ukraine and probably previously in Syria and Iraq, as well as in Afghanistan, but absolutely more so now, is that on today's battlefields, you can effectively see and hear almost everything. And if you can see it and hear it, you can target it. So what does that mean about strategic surprise? What does that mean for the future of expeditionary operations that the United States undertakes? What does it mean for how we think about the future of war, where everything is really out in the open? So let me elaborate on some of these points, and touch on some of the key themes that I think are important for our conversation today. Going back to the point number one about understanding the difference between concepts, innovation, and adoption. Like I mentioned, we fundamentally, and by we, I refer to myself and a lot of people in the US intelligence community and assessments of Russian capabilities, got things quite wrong. And I think an extent of it stems from being quite, I don't want to say careless, but perhaps careless to an extent, about making a clear differentiation between what is a conceptual idea, a theoretical concept in many ways, to what sort of technologies and capabilities are already in the pipeline, what is at the research and development stage, what has been experimented with and under what conditions, which is critical, to what is being adopted and integrated at scale. And how we talk about these issues is quite vital. And I think we're seeing that evolve right now with discussions of AI deployment and employment among the Ukrainian forces, for example. A couple of months ago, maybe timing is quite difficult, maybe it was only a few weeks ago, one of the most popular stories was that the Ukrainian forces are using AI-enabled facial recognition technology provided by the company Clearview AI in order to identify the bodies of Russian soldiers and then connect to their families and tell them that their family members have been killed in action. We also know, we don't know about the scale and utility of this technology, but it was one of the most widespread and one of the most popular stories in the media. And we are talking about it as if it's something that is proven to be effective, that has been used without any sort of hesitation, without ethical considerations, and that is being adopted in a way that works and is useful and should be considered by other militaries. We got to be really careful and at times really skeptical about operational employment of artificial intelligence, especially when we're talking about type of technologies that require significantly well-networked connection and connectivity and command and control. So again, making that differentiation between innovation and even employment to scaling is quite critical. And it will be absolutely essential when we estimate what China is doing. On that point of differentiating between concepts, innovation, and adoption. Another thing that I think we're learning really clearly from the Ukraine conflict is the importance of already existing military culture, military command and control, the structure, the force structure that is being employed, to the ability to use advanced and sophisticated technologies. One of the reasons that Ukraine has been so effective, also effective in integrating new technologies in its operation, has been the fact that it's adopted a lot of the NATO and US and Western models of command and control and force structure and trust among the ranks and trust between the ranks. The way that decisions are made is going to influence the way that technology, including AI, are going to be used, to complement and augment decision-making capabilities and reach decision advantage. So what you have already in place in terms of organizational capacity is going to matter a great deal to how and whether you're able to use technology effectively. And we're seeing that unfold in front of us. Really quickly on this point about the importance and increasing role of civilian technologies. We're seeing commercial technology being employed in a way that is compressing distances and really blurring geographical boundaries. One of my favorite example, it kind of seems trivial, but on Twitter, the Ukraine Minister of Digital Modernization was able to directly speak to Elon Musk and essentially crowdsource satellite technology to help Ukraine. Commercial companies are helping break up Russian disinformation campaigns and are exposing Russian cyber attacks in real time. And they're tracking the origination and the origins and the preparations for these campaigns as early as 1 year ago, if not earlier. So these commercial players, these non-state actors, we've already for a while have known that they play a significant role. But the way that we're seeing them play out now in a way that is supportive to Ukraine is a positive story from the Western perspective. But in a different type of a confrontation with a different alignment of actors, it might not play out to our advantage and to the advantage of our allies. I think a scenario that is very much top of mind for a lot of people is how would Chinese companies behave in a similar situation if we are engaged in some sort of a proxy conflict with China supporting actors on the other side? How will we be able to shape the information environment? How will we be able to employ how civilian technology is going to be employed at a tactical and operational level? So these factors are unfolding in front of our eyes, and I don't know if we have good mental models for understanding their effects. And finally, that brings me to the last point here about this almost ubiquitous visibility. And again, not something that is been invented at the war in Ukraine and just happening in 2022. It is something that we've been seeing over the last 20 years, but I think to a really new extent this year in particular, and in this conflict in particular, because we're seeing these near constant surveillance amplified by Russian mistakes, by unsecure communications that have allowed for near total visibility. And it effectively eliminated the opportunity and the possibility for strategic surprise. And it's really making it difficult to reach any sort of operational or even tactical surprise. So from the US perspective, we got to be thinking, what does this mean for our US Special Forces operations, for instance, or even large scale mobilization? What does it mean how we manage and control and shape the information environment where everything is out in the open constantly? How do we manage escalation and the possibility of miscalculations when we constantly see everything? Some of it might be true, some of it may be manipulated. The fact that intelligence that used to be held so closely by state actors and shared only within trusted coalitions is now something that the United States feels confident to share with Ukraine to what has been described as unprecedented levels of cooperation. And we know that it's been quite effective. Those Russian generals aren't just, dropping like flies on their own. They're clearly being targeted and identified, much likely with the help of US support. This visibility, this collection of data also opens a lot of opportunities for the United States to learn from this war. to learn based on operational data, which we know is very difficult to come by. And we oftentimes have to come up with innovative and technical solutions like synthetic data to augment how AI models, for instance, learn and train and draw their conclusions. Now we're at a point where we are incurring and collecting and analyzing massive amounts of operational data for training AI algorithms that can really move the DoD AI enterprise forward. But we got to be doing it very much in alignment with our ethical principles and our ethical guidelines, and with real safeguards for robustness and assurance and reliability going forward. So as we move to Sam and to our other speaker to discuss some of the other developments in innovation and modernization, I really want to make sure that we keep these 3 points in mind: the real difference between concepts, innovation, and wide-scale adoption, the increasing importance of civilian and commercial technologies and companies, and finally, what is this world where you can see everything and hear everything and therefore targeted mean for what's coming ahead? Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. And Samuel, I'm going to turn it over to you now and let us know if you have any issues sharing your screen.
Thank you so much, Tina. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'm sharing my screen right now. Thumbs up if you can see the slides.
We can see them. Looks
Excellent.
great.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you and your group. Look forward to establishing this cooperation and look forward to sharing the data that we have with all of your participants. Rita and I work in the same space, so it is great that she went first because she laid out a lot of the main concepts and the main points that really frame how we look at the war today and how we analyze the information that's coming from the war. I'm going to drill down a little bit more into what the Russians were doing and are doing in the Ukraine conflict. And so I'm going to have just a couple of slides just to guide me along and just to give you a couple more visuals and some of the factual representations of what the Russians are up to. A few words about myself. I've been looking at the Russian military and security and defense developments for quite a long time. In 2016, I joined Center for Naval Analysis. We are a federally funded research and development corporation. We work for the Department of Navy and the Department of Defense. I joined the Russia Studies program, which is today, I believe, the largest Russian military analysis group outside of the US government proper. And we have 9 full-time analysts looking at all aspects of the Russian military development, from the weapons systems to the deployment, to the concepts, to the operations. And of course, we're looking at the ongoing war in Ukraine 24/7, 365, so to speak, monitoring every major development from there. We also work with a lot of other parts of the US government. We do work for the non-military organizations. We work with the State Department. CNA as an organization also works with the organizations like DHS and FEMA on all kinds of applications. But my team specifically looks at the Russian military analysis. And so today, I'm going to share some of the information that we have gathered from this conflict. I do have to caveat my presentation by saying that all the information there is going to be public and drawn from the open sources. So all of that information is readily accessible and acceptable. As Margarita has framed the presentation in terms of differentiating between concepts, plans, and the actual use of technologies, I think this slide is going to be important going forward. Here, you can see sort of some of the Russian thoughts and discussions about advanced military technology in general. Within CNA Russia program, I look a lot at the development of the Russian military robotics, autonomy, and artificial intelligence. And so Russian military has been actually in lockstep with the larger international community looking at the applications of these technologies for the military. And so what Russians have thought and said about how they're going to be using military autonomy, how they're going to be using unmanned aerial vehicles of all kinds, unmanned ground vehicles, maritime vehicles, how they're going to be using artificial intelligence isn't necessarily that much different than what has been said and discussed in the United States, in the UK, in China, in Israel, in Turkey, Iran, and other countries which are investing a lot into these capabilities. But ultimately, Russian military wanted to have its advanced systems essentially make missions more effective, safeguard lives, and essentially win wars without the larger and mass-scale participation of human input. That is, in the near future to the far future, Russian military thinkers, Russian military developers, Russian military academia all thought that these technologies are going to more or less phase out the human component from conflict. Of course, they obviously spoke about these developments in real terms. They understood that these achievements aren't going to happen tomorrow. They're not going to happen the day after tomorrow. They're going to happen possibly within the next decade to 2 decades from now. But the Russian military did invest a lot in different types of projects that looked at the application of advanced technologies, such as, for example, robotics and artificial intelligence and cyber and precision-guided munitions for the conduct of warfare. And so Russian military, prior to February 2022, essentially thought of themselves as one of the major developers of military robotics, autonomy, and artificial intelligence. We have to caveat this by saying that most of what Russians actually mean by autonomy and robotics today are actually remote control technologies. And Russian military likes to use the word robotic as sort of this catch-all sexy phrase in analysis, in newspaper articles, in public relations statements and PR releases. But in essence, what the Russians were investing a lot is the development of remote control technologies for better informational situational awareness, for reconnaissance. They were investing a lot of these capabilities into the electronic warfare and cyber operations as well. Again, a lot has been said and written in the Russian military circles, in Russian military journals, and a lot has been said by the Russian government about the need and the eventual benefits of these technologies. But we also have to keep in mind that these technologies were tested at piecemeal. They were tested on a very small scale, and Russian military going into the war in Ukraine essentially bolstered one of the largest unmanned aerial vehicle fleets for target recognition, for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, but that was pretty much it. All of the other advanced technologies like unmanned ground vehicles for demining operations, its maritime systems, its naval autonomy, its artificial intelligence were tested on a very small scale. With a specific word about artificial intelligence proper, Russian military uses that to describe how artificial intelligence is going to essentially aid in decision-making capacity. Russian military discussed the application of AI and machine learning as an aid to the human decision maker, to the human soldier. They talked about AI not replacing humans, but actually working alongside humans, and artificial intelligence in key unmanned and autonomous systems were going to result in the Russian version of network-centric warfare, where different types of manned and unmanned, crewed and uncrewed technologies are working together in a single network in the aerial, ground, maritime, space, and informational domains. Russian military discussed cyber operations as part of their offensive and defensive packages. Russian military was discussing investments in electronic warfare as a way to negate the advantages by more advanced adversaries like NATO and the NATO allies. And of course, Russian military was also investing in precision-guided munitions and the development of long-range missiles like Iskander and hypersonics as a way to, first of all, bolster their defenses and offensive capabilities, but also negate some of the advantages offered by the adversary that the Russian military was probably preparing to fight, which was, of course, NATO, headed by the United States, the strongest military organization in the world and one that features the most advanced military technologies. And of course, heading into the war in Ukraine, starting with the first several weeks and now almost in the fourth month of fighting, we're seeing a lot of different issues that have emerged that have been already analyzed and discussed at length. And that is, it isn't just the technologies that actually win wars, it isn't the application of something advanced that gives a military its advantage. It's the combination, it's the preparation, it's the logistics, it's the command and control, and it's the overall military planning that involves everyone from the high up, from the president to the defense minister down to the last soldier. If that preparation and if that planning is done correctly, then the military force that has to fight on on the adversary's territory, and especially military force that has to meet a well-prepared adversary, is itself going to do very well. That didn't happen in the first couple of weeks of the war. We saw a lot of gaps in Russian capabilities. Now, as the Russian military slowly grinds its way through Donbass, gaining territory in the east, in the south, degrading Ukrainian capabilities, we see that it is a much more organized, it is a better prepared force. It is, of course, losing its own soldiers. It is sustaining heavy casualties, but these are the casualties that in the short to medium term, Russian military is prepared to undertake. And so in the current state of fighting, Russian military uses a lot of unmanned aerial vehicles. It is also using some of its unmanned combat aerial capabilities, something they didn't have prior to 2020. Russian military is refitting its regular ISR drones, those that are designed strictly for surveillance, for the combat capabilities. So it is gaining hundreds of potential attack points via such refits. Russian military also talked a lot about the employment of its loitering munitions, something that, again, it sees as absolutely pivotal in modern conflict, something that it saw take place in the wars across the Middle East, and especially in the Nagorno-Karabakh war. It isn't clear if the Russian loitering munitions are fully effective or if they're having an impact. It isn't even clear that they come with artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities as advertised. But the fact remains that the Russian military is committed to fielding advanced military technologies. We've witnessed actually right after the start of the war, that the Russian military conducted extensive cyber operations against Ukrainian civilian military and infrastructure targets. We know that the Russian military has talked a lot about using AI for data collection and analysis, and it is likely that the Russian military is in fact using artificial intelligence to analyze vast amounts of very disparate types of data coming from its operations in Ukraine. As Margarita has noted, civilian technologies are front and center in this war, and the Russian military is using a growing number of civilian drones to conduct short-range intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance. And what's not clear is whether this operation has been actually approved from the top, or if this is an organic development by Russian and Russian allied units who needed something because they actually lacked the official capacity, because they didn't have enough UAVs. And so today they're actually using a large number of different types of quadricopters and multi-rotor drones alongside military technologies. One of the biggest developments today in Ukraine is the Russia's extensive use of long-range artillery. And there, different types of drones are having an enormous impact on this war. In fact, Russia launches different types of drones for target acquisition, for target surveillance, in connection with its artillery and multiple launch rocket systems and units. This type of concept is called reconnaissance fire, reconnaissance strike contour, where unmanned aerial vehicles are basically eyes and ears in the sky, providing information in real time to Russian artillery. Russian military is also using extensive electronic warfare capabilities today to not only jam Ukrainian civilian and military UAVs, but actually blanket large parts of Ukraine with electronic warfare capabilities to deny signals and electronics intelligence and capabilities to the Ukrainians, and especially to the Western weapons that the Ukrainians are using. And of course, Russian military has advertised and showcased use of precision-guided munitions, long-range systems, and hypersonics, although in a very small scale, against Ukrainian targets. A lot of this targeting and a lot of this fighting is actually indiscriminate. Russian military is looking to degrade and attrit Ukrainian military to the point where it would have to come to the negotiating table or surrender completely. And the Ukrainian president recently remarked that, in fact, his military is losing hundreds of soldiers killed and possibly a lot more injured every day. Russian military may be sustaining the same type of casualties as well, but it is willing to do so because it has a set goal in mind, and it is willing to achieve its goal with the high losses of military personnel. Again, now that the Russian military is fighting a much better organized campaign militarily, logistically, and when it comes to its information capabilities, it is probably going to become more successful in launching certain attacks and in order to degrade Ukrainian capacity. So what does that mean going forward? The Russian military was probably preparing for this war. It probably stockpiled key technologies, key components. Now that the Western sanctions are so powerful that they're actually impacting a lot of Russian civilian and possibly military industries, we as the military analysts have to understand that going sort of on the day-to-day, day-by-day information about how that's impacting Russia isn't giving us the full picture. We have to see how all of this is going to impact Russian military capabilities this year, next year, and possibly for the next decade. And it is likely that Western sanctions are going to have limited effect on how the Russian military develops its weapons, how it develops key components, high-tech microelectronics and semiconductors going forward, and how it is actually going to fight and incorporate these high-tech components. Russian military has a lot of avenues for acquiring key technologies that are going to be denied to it officially by American and Western-led sanctions. It is instituting policies like parallel imports, where Russian government is going to import a lot of high-tech components without the permission of the original manufacturer. Russia still has a lot of allies and a lot of avenues to acquire key technology for its military operations, for the development and construction of military systems. Sanctions are an incredibly brittle thing. They cannot be enforced 100%. And so countries that are today under US sanctions have ways and find ways to actually find solutions for their military and the defense sector. And so now that the Russian military has showcased that it is capable of fielding certain advanced technologies for its military forces, the key question remains, what does that mean for the Russian defense sector, for the Russian government going forward? What does that mean for the resilience and sustainability of Russian defense manufacturing and the construction and development of different types of weapons and systems? At least for now, Russian government talks about all of this as if the war isn't necessarily happening. They're still talking about the development of autonomy, AI, machine learning tools, military robotics of all kinds, and how that is going to impact and take part and be actually a big part of future state armaments programs, where Russian government acquires different types of technologies and invests in different types of systems. So again, we are in just 100 plus days of this war. A lot remains to be seen. We're not necessarily drawing any definitive conclusions, but we are framing this war in the context that we understand today, and that certain technologies have a greater impact on the conduct of this war and future wars than others. There's access to civilian technologies, and Russia, as one of the largest economies in the world with one of the largest militaries, can in fact prove quite resilient in how it finds wiggle room for itself and for its defense manufacturers going forward under the current threat of sanctions. I'm going to throw up this slide with several links to CNA reports about the Russian military and especially some of its more advanced capabilities. For those who are interested, I'm going to share these slides with Tina and the rest of the group. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sam. I appreciate it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jewel, who is sitting right next to me. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and then we will turn it over to our last speaker. And then again, if you all have questions, post them in the chat. I can see you have been. If they're for a specific person, you can tag them as such. If they're just in general, and we will get to those after Jewel is done speaking. All right, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you both for the invitation to speak and the excellent job done by the previous two speakers, Sam and Margarita, that give a very good background. As I get now very much into the weeds to discuss our current deployment in support of an NGO that began kind of in December and January and is ongoing. There. So I'm a partner with Shipstone Security Consulting. We are primarily an information security and hardware security firm. We actually have two companies. We own a nonprofit and a for-profit wing, but we really are focused on trying to support humanitarian groups that are deploying into conflict areas and may lack some of the in-house expertise they need, not only for hardening communications and network, but also physical security, supply lines, and everything else that they may not have available to them. We do a fair bit of work on devices that I will touch on very briefly in this presentation. We maintain 2 device laboratories in the United States, one in Wyoming and one we're setting up here in Virginia. And we also have access to class 10, class 100 microelectronic clean rooms. So our evaluation and occasional customization goes, right to the chip level. So we have those capabilities. The client that we're going in support, which I'm not going to name, you can kind of disregard that graphic. Their logo is not up there. I think that's just generic videos. But they were an existing customer that we've done program evaluation for. We've helped them with previous deployments in Africa and the Middle East. They're an international aid agency. They have a permanent office in Eastern Europe. And anyone who cared to think about it would reasonably expect that they would deploy into any Eastern European country if there was a conflict or a humanitarian crisis. I'm actually going to to save some time, I'm going to skip through some of these, but this client started reaching out to us in July and August of last year, kind of telling us about some very curious things that were happening, for example, warehouses and hijacked trucks that contained nothing valuable that they could resell on the black market, or, pretty much the only purpose of these events seems to be to hamper this aid organization's ability to set up operations and deploy in the face of humanitarian crisis. I could talk for hours on the next couple of slides, but I won't. One of the things that they saw were some phishing attempts. That's when, you've all gotten those crazy emails with a suspicious link or file somebody wants you to open. These were extremely sophisticated. They were getting these all of last year. This one in particular came in December. We took a look at it. They actually successfully, this didn't get through their systems, but several of their employees were receiving emails that were very carefully crafted, specific to our client. Somebody spent a lot of time sending a very elegant looking email from a spoof domain that looked like it could get in through the door. And then when we took a look at the payload, which was a docx, like a Word document, we were able to quickly see some similarities between remote attacks that we've seen back in 2020. And we suspected and have since confirmed that this was a Turla attack. So what this really meant was that our client was being specifically targeted by a Russian-backed threat actor, which of course raised more than a few concerns. At this point, we sent personnel with the client to their regional office, and we were also making some trips. This is about December and January. We were making some trips with them into Ukraine to sort of talk to the officials there, talk to other aid groups there, and start doing some scenario analysis as to, what could happen and what would we do about it? What could this aid organization realistically provide in way of support for the civilian population? One particular thing, I'll try to be delicate about this, they asked us to look at was alternate operations for communications. They, like many NGOs, rely very heavily on commercial satellite comms, and they were having difficulty with this. What ground stations they had available were having a lot of software difficulty, not because of malware or any attacks, but because the software simply just wasn't working. And orders that they had placed for other ground station satcoms were being canceled, or the prices were being tripled, and basically they couldn't get the communication gear that they were going to need if they had to deploy. And they asked us to try to come up with some alternatives. Once we were on their ground at their regional office, again, I'm going to kind of skip over this, but we did see more indications that they'd actually been compromised on what was luckily a very segmented portion of their network. That attack we were able to attribute to the Armageddon group, which actually Ukraine's security service had just issued out a report. I believe this report in this graphic is from December. So again, it was a real clear indication that our client was directly being targeted by a Russian group, or Russian backing. So this is the end of January, early February. We're kind of ahead of the map that's on the slide. The client decided to deploy sort of a staging area into Ukraine so they could work more closely with organizations there. At this point, everybody was seeing a lot of feelers. There was a lot of concern about what was happening with tensions in eastern Ukraine and throughout the country. And the situation did seem to degrade. I'm not going to go into this too much. People can read the news and see what's going on. And this has been well reported on there. The map shown there, that's actually from our friends at ISW. I want to call out how important, as the other two speakers have spoken on, it was to have open source intelligence and people basically monitoring the information that's going through and producing useful, actionable analytic product in an open source way. And we relied on this very heavily, which I will talk about later, not just from ISW, but from a lot of other organizations that were keeping us apprised, especially when we ourselves didn't have the time to be monitoring all of our Twitter feeds and everything that was going on. So of course, you know, Ukraine, modern, technically advanced country, lots of, everybody's got a cell phone, a modern cell phone, Wi-Fi. This is very different from the kind of environment that we've done previous deployments in. So that was important. And also we had a very friendly, organized population. I will say my experience on the ground, everyone we talked to just did not believe in any way that Russia was actually go through with it and cross the border. But they were prepared, you know, they were very galvanized in case that should happen. One thing that I did want to call out, so one big technical landscape issue is that crowdsourced OSINT that the other speakers also have mentioned. But one thing that was really interesting that we saw, so about 2 weeks prior to invasion date of February 24th, we're on the ground. And on this map, I can't give specific locations, but we were deploying in southern Ukraine near the border, not one of the areas that was particularly a military target or had any noteworthy thing. Nowhere near really anything that's pink or red on that map that's on the first strike map there. But still, when we went in, of course, we're looking at communications, like what's the Wi-Fi access? How are our groups going to communicate? We're looking for communication options. And one of the things that we noticed right away was what I would characterize as a hostile network situation. There were a lot of suspicious open Wi-Fi networks that, you know, our devices, most devices will just automatically connect to the Wi-Fi point. And we were seeing a lot of interesting files dropped from these and commands and just, you know, these were not solid Wi-Fi networks. We also saw some spoofing of cell towers. This again, we're seeing our phones and other devices trying to connect to what's a legit tower, but then also some spoof points. This was really interesting. This is, again, a couple of weeks prior to the invasion date. And we're not talking about military grade electronic warfare with the big units that come up on trucks. This is something that's either homegrown or had been deployed by bad actors individually in the region. And one of the things we're still doing is trying to collect some data to people who were elsewhere in the country to see if this was a widespread thing. And we're still working on the analysis on this, but it was a very interesting thing to see on the ground. And it led us to have, like, yes, we have Wi-Fi available, but are we going to be able to trust it if we have to end up, you know, establishing secure communications, which of course we quickly did. On February 24th, this situation rapidly changed. Our client made the decision that they weren't going to be able to set up like a serious in-country supply and support mission. And they pivoted instead very quickly to doing emergency triage and looking for being mobile teams that could help with evacuation and obviously would be a growing refugee status in the next couple of weeks. To this end with communications, this is some innovation that we had to do on the ground. So as I mentioned, we're device people, we're gadgeteers. We come loaded with bags of black phones and little Raspberry Pi network secure modules that we plug into internet cafes and, you know, kind of place on the ground to get our own secure networks going. Low ray 915 megahertz, you know, basically a little custom hardware that we love to play with in handout. This wasn't going to work. Almost immediately, we were in sort of a mobile defensive action where we're trying to coordinate very quickly with other groups. We were relying again on that open source intelligence to tell us, where we were being hit, where we could move people safely, how we could get them across the border or to wherever they needed to go. We're trying to coordinate work with a lot of government agencies, a lot of groups on the ground, just private citizens who are stepping up to help, as they did wonderfully. So we weren't going to be able to use any of our usual bag of tricks. What we ended up doing was getting off the shelf a two-year-old intern project of an app that somebody had built, which creates basically a peer-to-peer network. It's like everybody, we all hook our phones together. It's an ad hoc network, not a mesh network. I won't get into the gritty details here in the interest of moving us along. But the problem with those networks are generally like they're totally unreliable, they're going to drop, they're not going to work, and they're completely insecure. And one thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about the landscape in Ukraine was that, again, we were already seeing, as soon as we entered the country, we had a lot of people saying, oh yeah, I'm getting all these crazy texts, SMS messages all the time of these scary photos or these messages that, we should get out of the country or we should hide or something. And that's all been widely reported in the press about, so people weren't going to trust regular text on their phone. So we had to come up with another option. And with the help of our team in Wyoming, that included 2 high school interns, thank you guys, we very quickly got this app in working condition. We got it loaded briefly into the Play Store so people could download it. They kept kind of a roving web link that would change, but we could deploy it. So anybody we came across and we wanted to work with and wanted to communicate securely, we were able to sort of just link up our phones or whatever devices were available. And if one of them had some capability for internet, and I will say our SATCOMs had completely dropped at this point. We had no there, but if somebody could get on the internet, we could get that capability too. But priority was establishing secure messaging through a disparate group. And I'm still kind of in shock. We were using Signal protocol, if anyone was curious, and I'm still just kind of shocked that this worked, but it did, it worked great. And that's, given the success of that application, that's something we're going to continue development on, find somebody to build a front end on it and get that deployed source that's available for everybody. So I did kind of fly through this pretty well, but so the status was we were able to, working with a lot of other groups and I mean, just everybody really helped in. We were able to establish those secure corridors, at least get a few paths for the evacuation. Communications never broke down, which is a real win. And I don't think I'm going to talk about the challenges too much. Everybody knows the situation. It's for humanitarian side of the house. There's a lot of problems. There's a degrading situation in Ukraine, a major humanitarian crisis. We're running out of supplies. Certainly, I know Roy's been waiting for me to talk about the humanitarian organizations that are working there face a lot of threats. We certainly had the experience where we were set up next to a children's medical clinic that was both bombed and subject to chemical attack. And so that was one of the cursors that obviously we had our own personnel and our clients' personnel injured. There were some fatalities in that clinic. And that led to our client to say, look, we're going to pull back to release the board. So those are the threats that we're trying to provide aid services are working with. I think that's it. That's a contact email. I know that was kind of a flyby of our experiences on the ground, but there's a contact email if there's any questions, or you can place them in chat.
Thank you, Jewel. Yeah, that was amazing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and then we're going to look at seeing a couple of questions pop in there. I know Sam was in there though too. So let's take a look at those and get those answered in the last 10 minutes here. So are you in a good spot?
Where you can speak?
Yeah, well,
or ask the questions?
Yeah,
Sure.
it's rolled up.
Yeah. Did the siphoning off of funds by the oligarchs impact the Russians' military technology advancements?
That was more to you, Sam.
Well, yeah, it's a good framing of the question. I think just kind of limiting it to the oligarchs in general is probably framing it in more than 1990s terms. I think this war has exposed some of the structural problems within the Russian military. It has exposed, again, some of the problems related to logistics and the preparation. And yes, certainly misallocation of funds is a problem and remains a problem, probably will remain a problem in the Russian military. So I wouldn't necessarily just say the oligarchs stole the money and therefore Russian military can't fight. My team is looking at the largest structural problem within this war. And the question we are asking is whether this was kind of the bad plan or the bad military. And so the first couple of weeks, we've seen Russian military executing a very bad plan of attack. And now that we are 111 days into this war, we're actually witnessing the Russian military itself, its armed forces, its all of its structures. And yes, some of the forces remained deficient, some of the forces lacked resources. But in the end, it is what a country and a military is willing to do, despite the losses and despite all of the problems that have been exposed. Despite all of that, Russian military is advancing. It is, in fact, slowly moving across the Ukrainian territory, gaining more of it almost every day. But I also have to note that acquisition problems, financial problems, and issues related to program cost overruns, misallocation of funds isn't just a problem that's unique to the Russian military. It's probably unique and prevalent, rather, for all of the large militaries with large budgets, not just Russian proper. And so this is kind of an evolving issue. The more we see of the Russian military performance, the more we see what technology and systems they're using, the more we're learning about the Russian military state prior to this war. And even if they talk more about its military robotics and AI and less about the regular force structure and composition, it also kind of gives us a view of what actually was important for the Russian military, how it chose to invest and what it chose to invest in.
Thanks, Sam. And I think the next one kind of goes to you, and you touched on this, but how long can the Kremlin continue to spend when the Russian economy is suffering from the sanctions?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think there's a good answer to that. I don't think we can say definitively right now that, let's say, in the next 6 months, Russian economy will collapse. It is a diverse economy. It is a resilient economy. And the Russian government, and especially its military, must have been preparing for a day like this. They have been stockpiling certain technologies. They were trying to find ways to essentially divest themselves of dependence on certain imported technologies. And the sanctions are affecting some segments of the economy a lot more than others. They're certainly affecting civilian high-tech sector. They are affecting the military high-tech sector also, but to what extent, we don't know. The sanctions may not have a very big effect on other parts of the Russian economy. And therefore, the sanctions themselves may not be impacting large segments of the Russian population, which were not themselves dependent on a lot of the imported tech and imported systems that are no longer available. So again, I would not draw any conclusions right now, but I would like to essentially kind of fast forward to 6 months from now and see how the Russian government, its central bank, its government institutions are actually adapting to this. And I'll give Rita an opportunity to also speak on that.
I will simply say that the decision to start a war and terminate a war is a political decision in the end of the day, and it's a question of prioritizing resources. It's unclear what is the goal of the sanctions, at least looking from the Russian standpoint. Is it meant to punish them for starting a war? Is it meant to pressure them into stopping a war? Is it meant to disassemble and completely destroy the Russian economy? Is it meant to remove Putin from power? What is the end goal of sanctions and what is the end state for their removal? So from the Russian perspective, there has to be greater clarity for that in order for that to have effects, right? So the impact of the sanctions on the Russian economy can be significant and substantial, and it may or may not translate into the ability to, continue fighting the war effectively. But in the end of the day, it is going to be a political decision up to which point they want to continue fighting and what are they just going to prioritize across their, resources distribution. So we both need better clarity into understanding what is the purpose of sanctions, what is our theory of change here in some ways, and from there, kind of gain a better understanding of what we expect the Russians to do.
Thank you, Margaret and Sam. I've got a question for Jewel here. So do you have insight into the cause for the issues you experienced with SATCOM use there? Was it deliberate signal interference or more mundane causes?
I would say for our experience, that was a mundane cause. We had been having issues with the software deployed on that slightly older model of ground station for a while. They hadn't been able to resolve it with the provider. And eventually, they kept resetting the field. This is a heavy, clunky station. We're in loop motion. So I think the end of, or maybe early April, we just sort of gave up and put them back on a truck and went with other options, because as long as we could access internet some way, sort of get those ISW maps, get feedback from other people, kind of figure out what our daily plan was, then it was more important to just make sure that our communication between the group where we were trying to move was working. And SATCOMs was just really frustrating. And we did have a lot of back and forth, hey, we're under fire, we're on the ground here. Can you get this up and working for us? And it was really the commercial product provider that I feel really dropped the ball on that.
Great. I think we're going to do one last question, and Sam, I'll start with you, and then Margaret, if you want to chime in on it. So, Sam, how much validity would you put on the rumors that the Kremlin has billions in cryptocurrency, which will reduce the impact of the sanctions?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm not a cryptocurrency expert. I've sort of looked at it tangentially as I try to sort of understand the larger impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. Russian government officially has been rather reticent and hesitant to adapt the cryptocurrencies in general prior to this war. They were talking about launching their own digital ruble, just as other countries like China are talking about launching their own digital currencies. If some form of a cryptocurrency is going to be a way for Russians to bypass the sanctions and maintain payments and schedules, then I guess the Kremlin will try to adapt and use that in one way or another. But I don't have enough information, certainly not from the open sources, to make any definitive judgment or claim to that. So it's a very interesting question. This is something that is probably worth monitoring right now.
Thanks, Sam. And Rita, any other additional thoughts there?
I mean, we can look and think about sophisticated outlets like cryptocurrency, but in the end of the day, we live in a simple oil-dependent world. And as the oil and gas prices are rising in the US and in Europe, we might be experiencing greater pushback against the sanctions. So I think sometimes the easiest answer is the most approachable and potentially the most correct one is watch the oil markets.
Thanks, Margaret. All right, one last question, and then as Jules answering this, I'm going to share my screen with some resources for you all. Again, we will be sharing this slide deck to everyone that's on here. So one last question for Jewel. What is the difference in the technology between WhatsApp and Signal? Who owns Signal? Where was it developed? Was WhatsApp not used because of who owns it?
I'm going to give a very brief answer to that. So the difference is really the encryption technologies and the ownership. Signal's open source. You can take a look at that code. That we actually use the Signal protocol, though not Signal itself. So that's an encryption that we trust and we can look at. WhatsApp has, I'll just let you Google that one. There's some ownership questions about that. There's some registered sort of backdoors that they allow. access to various people that we don't quite know exactly who might have access to that messaging. And in general, it's just, it's not open source. So if we can't take a look at it, we choose not to trust it.
Great. Well, again, I want to thank all three of our speakers. We really appreciate you all taking the time to share your insights into this conflict right now. And then, again, you will have these slides, but we have some upcoming Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge events. We've got another Tech Talk in August. And then at the end of August, we're going to be hosting a DoD SBIR proposal workshop. If you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll know about all these. And we're also using Eventbrite for all of these events. So you can follow us on there too to get the latest and greatest. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.